Welcome back guys to another tutorial. Today we're going to be sewing the Jun top. For once I actually am wearing the thing that we're going to be talking about. It's been kind of a long time coming because I did intend to have this out for Chinese New Year. However, there were some bumps in the road, and with every new pattern I put out I always try and make it better than the last. I have started putting illustrated diagrams into the written pattern. I did get feedback that a lot of people actually don't want to watch the video. They would rather have everything be in the paper document, and so we have diagrams now. Before we start, there are two things that I want to mention. First of all, with the notions, I do want to warn you guys, the zip may be hard to find. I think some of my testers were also struggling with that. I did have to find mine online. I used J-Cots, not sponsored or anything, but they were literally probably the only site that I could find such a large selection on, and even then they don't have all the lengths in all the colors. However, one of my testers did use a close-ended zip and they said that they could get it over their heads. I'm gonna talk more about how you can see if that's gonna work for you at the tester notes period of the video, but just bear that in mind. The front closure is also something you can completely customize. I do kind of have a diagram in the written instructions about how I sewed these on. One final thing that I want to mention is the fact that the Jun top is obviously heavily influenced by traditional Chinese clothing. I'm not amiss to the fact that Chinese culture is kind of trending, which is a little strange for me since growing up in all of the schools I was either the only or one of two Chinese people in my entire year group. Being Chinese was never cool, and now it is, and it's a little bit strange with this like Chinese culture being a trend and the increasingly popular Tang jacket inspired pieces from Adidas. My stance on it is that it's already happening. Like, the trendization of culture is already happening, and I don't think there's much that can be done to stop it. That being said though, I think anyone should be allowed to make their own tops inspired by a culture that is not theirs, as long as they understand that tops like this are inspired by the Qipao and the Chongsam, which is why I think calling it what it is the least that somebody can do. For example, with the whole dupatta trend, everyone was just calling it a Scandinavian scarf, and I think the backlash around that would not have been so bad if people were just happy to call it what it is, you know? That being said, I highly encourage you to go ahead and make this top if you like the design. I worked really hard on it, and wouldn't you rather give your money to somebody who's actually Chinese? Sure, I might be incredibly biased in saying that, but I would rather give my money to someone who's from the culture that their product is being inspired by, you know? We're gonna start the tutorial now. Here's everything you'll need. First, you need some fabric. I did film this clip after I had already finished sewing the top, so don't mind the seams. This is a cotton twill. It's about 200 GSM. It's a lot lighter than the denim one I made, but here are some other fabric examples just to make more Jun tops. This first one is a soft canvas that has been embroidered. This tartan one is like a heavyweight cotton that has been printed, and the denim is definitely the heaviest. To be honest, I think all of these are much closer to 300 GSM, which is similar to the blue denim as well. Next, you need some interfacing that is suitable for your fabric. This is just for the collar and the facing, so you only need about 1/4 meter. For the fastening, you need an open-ended zipper, ideally plastic. Here I have two YKK nylon zippers. The white is a number 3 and the wine is a number 5. I much prefer the number 3 as it's not as bulky. However, these can be hard to find, especially for non-neutral colors. Please see this chart for the exact length that you need. These open-ended zippers can be a real pain to shorten, and after you shorten it, they never really look the same at the top. So I would recommend purchasing the closest available zipper to the length in the chart, because it doesn't make that much of a difference if it's a couple of centimeters shorter than the hem. Some bias binding. You'll need 1.6 meters of either single or double fold. The one that I'm using here is a 1.5 centimeter width with a single fold. Finally, some fasteners of choice. These are purely decorative, so you can literally use whatever you want. I used the lobster clips for my first sample, and then these PVC frog fasteners for my second sample. I also like to use an overlocker for my seams. However, you can finish them however you'd like. Now we can finally begin. First, you want to cut your pattern out onto your chosen fabric and also interfacing. The written instructions instructions goes into this much clearer, so please reference that. For the interfacing, just iron these on to the back of your collar and facing pieces. Remember as well, for interfacing, you always want to cut this wrong side up. So the first step is to overlock the center back seam on both of the back pieces. However, I do have to confess that for this tutorial, I forgot to do that until much later, but I've inserted the clip here. So even though it looks like the collar is already attached, you should do this as the first step. Then overlock the center front edge of the front shoulder and turn it back 1 centimeter. Then top stitch it in place. So the front shoulder piece to the facing piece, match up the center front notch like so, right sides together along the curved edge, then bias bind the raw edge to finish. Line the bias binding up to the curved edge. Stitch along the first crease. Then fold the bias binding over to the other side and then top stitch the other edge down. Give everything a press. So one back center to the corresponding front shoulder, along the shoulder seam, right sides together. Then sew the back center to the front center along the other shoulder seam, right sides together. Finish the seams by overlocking and pressing towards the front pieces before top stitching 5 mm from the seam. Also give that a press. Sew one unfused collar piece to the facing right sides together. You want to match the notch at the center front, and all you're going to do is just sew over that tiny overlap. Press the seam allowance into the collar as well as the rest of the collar up by 1 centimeter. Sew one fused collar piece to the front center neckline. Once again, you're going to match that center front notch and pin that collar all the way around. I don't show it here, however, trim the seam allowance back to about 6 mm, but do not trim past the notch. This side can be a bit difficult to press, but you want to press it towards the collar. Sew the facing to the front center as well as the 2 collar pieces together in 1 stitch, right sides together. Make sure the inner corner where the collar and facing meet is perfectly lined up. As you can see here, the new stitch literally stitches right over the old one. When you turn it to the right side, you can kind of see how all of the seams converge into one point. Then cut into the corner and trim the seam allowance back to about 6 mm. Ignore the overlocking, I did it wrong. I was still kind of experimenting at this point, and I also don't show that you're supposed to trim across the whole seam, but yeah, you should do that. Turn the collar right side out and press. All the seam allowance around the neckline should be facing upwards between the 2 collar pieces. For the left collar, sew the remaining collar pieces together, right sides together along the top edge. Trim the seam allowance back to about 6 mm, then turn right sides out and press. Pin and sew the upper collar only into the other neckline. The center front edge should meet the seam of the collar exactly for the neatest edge. For some reason in this clip I've started sewing from the center back, but I would actually suggest sewing from the center front. That way it's easier to perfectly match the collar and the front piece. Once again, trim the seam allowance back to about 6 mm. For the neatest seam, press open the seam and then press upwards towards the collar. Press the edge of the outer collar up by 1 cm as well as the seam allowance at the center front so that you can tuck the seam allowance upwards. The raw edges should be hidden between the 2 collar pieces. Next, we are going to be sewing the zip since it needs to be inserted before the top stitching on the collar is complete. Mark part of the seam allowance onto the paper pattern. Here, this is an older version of the pattern, so I already have the seam allowance marked out. However, for the one that you have downloaded, there should only be 1 line, so you have to remark the seam allowance onto the paper pattern. Then use the paper pattern to mark the notches onto the zip. Remember to exclude the seam allowance when marking. Separate the zipper and pin each side onto the corresponding center back seam, right sides together. Match the top of the zipper teeth to the seam between the two collar pieces. Sew the zipper in place with a zipper or narrow foot using a 1 cm seam allowance, starting from the top of the zipper teeth, not the top of the tape. Turn the undercollar and remaining zipper tape over to the front and match the edge of the undercollar to the seam of the top collar. Stitch over the zipper while folding the zipper tape down and to the side so that it is out of the way. Make sure you sew around the top corner so that you can cut the corner without the stitching coming undone. Turn the collar and zipper right side out. Repeat steps 17 to 19 for the other side of the zipper. Give everything a press. Pin undercollar in place with all seam allowance pointing up between the two collar pieces. I find that I have to do this kind of curling motion with my finger to get the top edge to sit completely turned out. I also find that it's kind of helpful to add an initial row of pins to hold it whilst you line up the bottom edge. From the front, top stitch along the neckline about 2 mm from the edge to close the collar. Repeat on the other side. This clip has been sped up 20 times, so go very slowly. You want to catch all of the collar underneath. Make sure you backstitch at the start and at the end. From the front, top stitch along the top edge of the left collar down to the center of the neckline. Top stitch around the top edge of the right collar as well, however continue it down to the end of the faux opening in one line of stitching. Stitch about 5 mm from the edge. Now we will be sewing together the main body. Sew both front side and back side pieces together along the side seams, right sides together, and then to the rest of the bodice in any order. Here I'm sewing the front side and the back side together first, and then doing the princess seams along the front and the back. Do not finish the seams with top stitching or overlocking just yet. I usually don't demand that you pin something, but I am demanding that you pin the curved seams. If you don't, it's very easy for one to slip more than the other, and then you'll end up with like a longer bit on one side at the end. Just trust me, you do want to pin this seam before you sew it. Ignoring the fact that it is a whole size too big for me, at this point you can like pinch it, see if you need to adjust anything, and then it's really easy to just restitch the seams since we haven't overlocked them or finished them or anything. After you've made any necessary adjustments, if you need to, proceed to finish the seams by overlocking, pressing to one side and doing a 5 mm top stitch. Press all the seams towards the center of the body and the side seam towards the front. The written instructions has a very clear diagram about which orientation you should sew the seams. Hem the garment by overlocking, pressing under 1 cm and top stitching. Can't lie, it was kind of rough trying to overlock over the end of the zipper, so it's actually a pro if your zip is like a couple of centimeters shorter. Give the hem a press. Now we will construct the sleeves. Skip to step 30 if you are making the sleeveless version. Finish the sleeve hem by overlocking, turning under 1 cm and top stitching. Press into place. Pin and sew the sleeve into the armhole, right sides together, matching up the notches. There is about 1.5 cm of ease in the sleeve cap between the notches. Space this out evenly as you sew so that there is no puckering. Repeat steps 27 to 29 for the other sleeve. Now we will finish the armhole with bias binding. The bias binding is done in the same way as the facing edge in the step 3. The only difference is that we're doing it in a circle. Whether you have attached the sleeve or not, the following steps are the same. Turn the garment so that the wrong side is facing you. Unfold and pin the bias tape to the edge with a small tail of about 1 to 2 centimeters. Fold the tail widthwise so that the end of the binding will have a clean edge. Continue to pin the bias tape along the armhole until you reach the beginning. Trim the bias tape so that it is about 1 to 2 centimeters longer and lay this over the folded bias tape at the start. Sew into place following the crease of the bias tape closest to the edge. Then along the underarm, make small snips into the seam allowance, careful not to cut into the stitching. This just helps turn the sleeve under after. Turn the bias tape over to the other side of the seam and stitch into place close to the folded edge. Do this all the way around the armhole. If you are doing the sleeved version, turn the seam allowance inwards at the underarm where the sleeve ends by 1 centimeter. Start at the corner of the sleeve where the top stitch starts and continue the line. Then pivot and stitch along the underarm until you reach the other corner of the sleeve, pivot again and meet the top stitching on the sleeve. For the sleeveless version, the only difference is instead of pivoting, you are just going to turn it under and stitch all the way around. Repeat steps 30 to 33 for the other armhole. Give your armholes and sleeves a press. Finally, the last step, which is the decorative fastenings. As I mentioned before, there are so many ways you can do this. Here I just have a very brief demonstration about how I did the PVC frog fasteners. Usually I would recommend just tacking frog fasteners on by hand. However, these ones were PVC, so they were really hard to get through. I just stitched a perimeter around each leg of the frog fastener. They seemed to work just fine, however it was quite difficult to get around the bobbly bit of the frog. If you want to know how I did the lobster clips, I would recommend looking at the written instructions because there is a complete illustrated diagram on there and I think that explains it better. Of course the method is going to be different depending on which kind of decorative fastening you choose. If you don't want to add any fastenings, I would just tack the opening into place from the inside, especially at the center front where the collar meets, and then maybe a few tacks along the curve. After you've done that, we are finished. So I've got a couple of pattern notes from the testers. These are things that I personally might have not experienced. However, I thought it would potentially be useful to someone to pass some of these on. So one tester did say that they recommend sizing down if you have a straighter body shape. And she said she found it quite roomy around the bust. If that is the case for you, what I would say is sizing down, but then potentially adding some width around the waist, because obviously it's also going to get smaller around the waist and you don't want it to be too tight. The second note, which I mentioned earlier, is about the zip. Two of my testers tried it out with a closed-ended zip. They said it was a little bit tight to get on, but it was possible. So if you really want to use a concealed closed-ended zip, what I would say is make sure it reaches the hem. That way you have the biggest width to work with. You can see if something is going to fit over your head by taking the measurement of the entire hem and then measure it out on a piece of string, tie it into a loop and see if you can get that loop over your head. Those are the two notes that I got. All the other notes that I've gotten have been put into the pattern and made it better. So once again, thank you to my testers. They have been amazing. That is it for me today. If you do try this, please tag me. As always, I love seeing it. Even if you just want to DM me your photo, it has been a joy to put together and make it available. If you do purchase or you have purchased, thank you so much. I will see you in the next one very soon.